This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. I'm your host, Darren McKee, and with me, as usual, is Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
We have a great show for you today. Adam is going to look into whether you should let your food cool before putting it in the fridge.
That's right.
Chilling. But first, I'm going to give you a little overview on how to cultivate critical thinking.
Ooh.
Longtime listeners may realize that our show tries to cultivate critical thinking with two main approaches. First, lead by example, where we explore a topic using the methods of science, rationality, and critical thinking. Mm-hmm. This provides a template of sorts for the investigation of topics. We've done this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times.
That's right.
And two, presentations and discussions on the methods and tools of critical thinking themselves or itself. It's been a while since we've had a segment on critical thinking itself, so I thought I'd devote my segment to it. Now, nothing revolutionary here, but more a reminder of some key points as critical thinking is hard to do, especially as concerns about misinformation are on the rise, and we seem to be in an increasingly polarized world. Although that should probably be a future segment on its own just to assess how true that is.
Mm-hmm. I have a strong polarized opinion on whether or not that's true.
Magnetically. Eternal vigilance is the price of accuracy, one might say. I also want to highlight two other themes I've tried to cultivate all these years. First, cognitive humility, understanding that you may be wrong and to act with that in mind. And second, don't be a jerk. Sometimes, when people learn about critical thinking, the biases and the fallacies, they are weaponized and used without a deeper appreciation of context. Namely, it's not enough to be right. There is usually another goal, to persuade someone of something, or perhaps even to have good relationships with others. Mm-hmm. No point being so annoying, even if you're right, that people either don't want to hang out with you, or worse, dismiss you and the methods of rationality because of a negative association.
Yeah, it's like a long game kind of thing.
Yes, and I think we've all been there. And no one is perfect, but something good to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. So let's do a quick rundown of some of the most important cognitive biases. You can play on your own which you think is your favorite. Number one, there's not really a list here. Confirmation bias. Well, as you know, we've talked about this many times. We tend to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs and ignore evidence to the contrary. This is pervasive, it happens to everyone, and it's really pernicious.
Yeah.
Number two, Ingroup bias. Our tribalistic tendencies lead us to favor our immediate group over outsiders. Mm-hmm. This also seems pretty pervasive. You see the various obvious examples in sports and politics, but I think it goes much deeper than that in terms of however you might have your identity formed and what it's related to, and then people who don't fit that identity.
I think the troubling one with this one is it might actually be useful to go along with it, even if it's wrong, even if it brings you to the sort of incorrect conclusion about things.
Well, that's the broader picture. Like, what is one trying to achieve here? Mm-hmm. And I think we might have covered it a while ago on the show about like this identity protection thesis, where if everyone around you doesn't believe in climate change, you believing in climate change doesn't do much. Like, it really doesn't help the world that much because you're just one person, and you probably don't have that much influence or power. But socially, you just took a huge hit and your whole life is a lot worse now.
Yeah.
So we can have some sympathy for those situations, of course. Recency bias. Was that the Ingroup bias? Recency joke. Favoring recent events over a complete picture of reality or truth. Of course, it happens all the time. No, it just happened. Your base rate neglect here is what the fundamental thing is going on there. Anchoring bias, over-relying on initial information when making decisions. This happens often in marketing, right? You're shown a product at a certain price, usually a very high price, and then other prices seem lower by comparison.
Yeah.
This is often why you're like, why would that chair be so expensive at the entranceway of the store? Like, well, it's not there to actually be sold as a chair.
Yeah.
And I recently bought a flight to go to Europe, and I had one of the unfortunate experiences. If you're clicking through, and it goes, this price is no longer available.
Oh.
Yes. And then it happened again after I got to the point where I even put in all the credit card information. I was like, come on. And so, that's still a privilege to fly. Don't get me wrong. But of course, now my brain anchored to that lower price. So now I feel I got ripped off, even though, again, a chair in the sky is pretty amazing, but it's hard to get past that now.
Absolutely.
Even though I understand kind of what happened. Sunk cost fallacy. Continuing an investment, financial or emotional, because of past commitment, even if it's irrational. Well, of course, because it's rational. This one is also so common. I think this is why almost most average people should not play stocks. They should not gamble. They just can't let things go. Throwing good money after bad is the idiom. Or if we leave this country we've been in a war with now, all those lives will be for nothing. Well, that's not how things work. They work for nothing already. It's are you likely to succeed, right?
Yeah, it seems to be a big problem in war and global issues. Yeah.
Hindsight bias, seeing past events as predictable after they've occurred.
Oh, yeah.
Monday morning quarterbacking, as they say, for everything else. A lot easier to see this from a distance, as they say, for hindsight bias. Hindsight's 2020. It's especially pernicious because people think it's not happening. They think, if I was in that situation, I would have done the thing which is now obvious. Yeah. Versus, you're only saying that because you have the information now, which is why things like prediction markets or writing down your own beliefs or doing an annual prediction show to do is good, because then there's a mark in time of what you thought and what you said was going to happen, so you can't, rig the system later. And another fave, availability heuristic, overestimating the importance of easily recalled examples or recent experiences. This is literally when you go to encounter the world, something happens and your brain looks for something that's related, and whatever pops in seems like it is then representative of the overall state of things. The more easy way to say that is shark attacks are very visceral.
Yes.
People dying from vending machines is not visceral. It's not even reported much. And so when you think of a certain incident, because it is easily to be recalled, your brain thinks, well, therefore it happens more frequently. Something like this, not literally, but your brain, because it usually kind of tracks reality to some extent, right? That otherwise you wouldn't function that well. So there is something to if my brain's thinking it now, it is more relevant to the situation than something else. But this is when it is suboptimal or not designed to give you the outcome you want. Those are only the biases I was going to cover. Again, there's tens and tens of these, or hundreds if you look at variations on a theme. Is there any that were left out, Adam, that are some of your faves?
Oh boy, you kind of caught me off guard here. There probably are, and if I thought about it, there'd probably be some, I think, where I looked up a list on Wikipedia or something. There'd probably be others. But no, I mean, those are the big ones. Every time you say a new one, I'm like, oh yeah, that one's huge,
It's said the segment's about biases, but we can't discuss biases without logical fallacies, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So here are some of the key fallacies people commit. Number 1, ad hominem, attacking the person making a claim rather than addressing the claim itself. This is so common, right? It is staggeringly common. This is what almost all political discourse consists of. No, that's an overinterpretation. When there's a debate, this is often what this consists of, right?
Yeah, we saw a perfect example of that yesterday, which I guess by the time the show gets out might be, a few days to a week. And there's a subset of the ad hominem, which is, I think, tukoka, which I write in if I'm pronouncing that wrong, which is dismissing someone's argument because they themselves are guilty of the same thing. This has come to be known as whataboutism. I don't know if it's popularized by John Oliver or someone else, but, well, what about what you're doing? What about this? It's no. What matters is whether the thing that you're doing is wrong or not whether there's someone else did it, right? It's like, yes, say one cares about Trump having affairs. It is not that relevant whether Bill Clinton also had affairs, especially because Bill Clinton's not in the race. Well, it's like this, who is without sin cast the first stone. It doesn't mean there was no other sin. Of
course, now if you are judging character, then that's where it comes into play. But my annoyance with a lot of this in the political realm is it has no sense of scale or gradation. Yep. Right? It's like, oh, you do it too. Yes, but like 1/100th how much you do it. And that is relevant, right? It's like, we've committed crimes. Yes, I double parked and you stabbed someone. These are not the same thing.
Or you did it too. Yes, and you raked me through the coals when I did it.
Well, exactly. Exactly. Now, straw man is another one, and this is somewhat similar than an ad hominem. These almost go together. Misrepresenting someone's argument to make it easier to attack. It's not quite the same thing, but it's often very much linked. Another one is false dilemma or false dichotomy, presenting only two extreme options when more exist. This is also very, very common. Following the Bush-era presidency, I came up with a line of, there's only two types of people in this world. Those who don't understand false dichotomies, and those who hate freedom.
Very good.
There's also the slippery slope fallacy, assuming a minor action will lead to extreme consequences. Well, we can't let that happen. Or this other thing, which is 10 steps down the line, might happen. Now, once in a while, there is some truth to here, right? Just because something is a fallacy doesn't mean there's never any valid usage of a concern that if you start with this, then it leads to something more and leads to something more. But the other line I made for that is that, the slippery slope is itself a slippery slope to worse arguments and fallacies once you start using them. The good old bandwagon fallacy, believing something is true because many people believe it. This is also like argumentum ad populum, if you want the fancy Latin, deferring to the population. Look, all these people believe, like, if everyone jumped off a bridge, would you? Right? Your parents knew this one.
Probably.
Yeah, what kind of bridge?
Yeah.
Appeal to authority is another key one, relying solely on an authority figure's opinion without evaluating their reasoning. Well, it must be true because X person said it, right? The leader, the religious leader, the political leader, even the academic. Well, this person says, like, yes, but do they have reason and evidence? Now, as one is navigating the world, it is the case that some figures are more trustworthy than others. And if you spend a lot of time verifying the figures that you think are more reliable and found them to be so, you could provisionally trust them because that person has said it. But it's not a good argument, right? Something is true or not because it's true or not, or there's good reasons and evidence or not because X academic said it or didn't.
Yeah, I think it's a good shorthand. While there are a few people that I would sort of like trust their opinion on anything, within certain domains, some people are sort of more trustworthy. And
correct.
You can factor that in, but
right.
You still kind of need those reasons to make sense.
The other interesting thing for me is that when I'm evaluating the reasoning or logic of people who I consider smarter right?
Sure.
or more knowledgeable than I am, right? So I agree with Dennett on most things and not on everything though. But sometimes when I do disagree with him, like, well, but he might be right though. I just could be missing it. So, well, again, like the average person hasn't had 60 years to explore a topic like Richard Dawkins or something else. It's like, yeah, well, no one's perfect, but are you going to challenge the 60-year experience academic? Maybe. Again, put the asterisk in there. Always good to check. Do your own research, as they say.
That's like a bit of a pejorative. Do your own research lately, right?
It is. Yes, I was being a bit facetious there. Where we want people to do their own research, but it turns out that's very hard. So for a lot of people, you shouldn't. That seems weird to say, right? That's a bad conclusion.
Yes.
It's like, well, you should trust the scientists. Like, well, that's not that good either. But
you should do your own research, but you should be thorough and methodical about it. And that research should include relying on experts to a certain extent.
But who has the time? Right. That's one of the reasons we do the show is because we realize most people don't have the time. So we're spending some of our time to give you more time because we're trying to look into stuff and have training in science and tools of rationality and how to do these types of stuff. But it's not to say we're perfect at it or experts. So there's a difficulty of just trying to understand the world.
Yeah.
And finally, circular argument. Restating the conclusion as part of the premise without offering any real evidence. This happens very frequently where someone, like, their premise is their conclusion. Yeah. And like, well, you don't agree? Like, that's not an argument. You're just saying what you believe. And that's fine if you can just say it as an assertion, but don't dress it up like an argument. Now, Adam, now that you had some time to think about it.
Oh boy. Yeah.
It is hard to come up with logical fallacies that I didn't mention off the top of your head, right? Argument from antiquity. I know you love that one.
Gambler's fallacy or reverse gambler's fallacy, right? Like either you're due or there's streaks. I think that's a common one, but that's not really like an argument people use. That's just like something people get wrong, mostly in the world of sports. I'm not really a sports guy, but it's just a very common thing. And it probably, people gamble and stuff like that. It's very bad. I don't want to say that's a favorite of mine, but it's a big one, I think, that you mentioned.
Yeah. So, as would be a surprise to no one here, it sure is a lot easier to read such a list than to do it and incorporate them all into your life and to do it all in practice. As many have said, the easiest person to fool is yourself. So I want to explore how we use these things with a couple examples, both somewhat theoretical, but then also maybe more practical in the world. And just to see, what does this look like in practice? How are we going to play with this stuff, right? Because again, the list is one thing, but to incorporate it into your life is more difficult.
Absolutely.
So I think there's a great quotation from the Bible, Matthew 7:3, where it says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" This is sometimes used with different words, but that's one of the main translations. Now, you could say, quoting a Bible verse, what just happened? I mean, Darren was away last week. Did he have a traumatic head injury?
Nice.
Yes. But let's play along, right? So upon hearing this, one could react and say, why would you cite a religious text? The most famous religious text. That's deference to authority. And perhaps even the logical fallacy of argument from antiquity, as the Bible is very old, tradition and so on. Perhaps, but I was not saying that one should give the idea more weight because it was biblical. As such, criticizing the use on those grounds is its own fallacy. This is actually called the fallacy, or this is the genetic fallacy. I know. This is like the checkmate game. So like, oh, you think you're a nerd? I'm a nerd. This is where you're accusing of something of being a fallacy, but it's not actually fallacious at the time. Now, someone might write in and say, well, it's actually when it's true that's not a fallacy, even though it is mirroring the fallaciousness of this. Yeah. But why I wanted to raise it is that, yes, just because something has the appearance of a fallacy doesn't mean it is, which may not be the precise usage.
Or even like it's like there's weight to a fallacy, right? So it's like it doesn't make it incorrect, but there's like, okay, there's a bit of an indicator that it may not be true just because, right? So arguing from antiquity, maybe some things can have value because they've been believed for so long and they've sort of withstood the test of time or whatever, or maybe there's a better reason that people came up with it than we give them credit for. So it doesn't make it true, but it doesn't make it wrong and it doesn't make it true, but it influences the likelihood. Right?
Yeah, these are guides for how to understand the world, right? And one has to be cautious. And why I mentioned genetic fallacy is that's usually when the source of an idea or something like that is used to dismiss the idea, which is invalid.
Yeah.
As I said in my book, whether vegetarianism is a good idea or not is separate from whether Hitler and Gandhi were vegetarians, right? Like, well, Hitler was a vegetarian, therefore it's bad. Well, Gandhi was, therefore it's good, or however you might want to do it. It doesn't matter. Now, there is this guilt by association that is how the world works, and you have to be careful of who you're associated with or tainted by. Sure. But an idea should stand on its own with reason or evidence to support it or not who said it. This is very difficult for most people to interact in the world, especially in any sort of like socio-political domain, right? Well, that bad person said the thing that seems reasonable, so now we can't be reasonable anymore. It's very frustrating.
And specifically with the Bible, obviously, there are tons of things that will just like very obviously just be very simple truths.
Yes.
And there are a ton of things that are like, actually, the Bible supports it and is terrible. Like supports, of course, slavery, violence, whatever you want, right?
Many other things
of women, whatever.
Sure. So the point, though, why I was mentioning this is what we care most about is the content of the idea or words or so on, right? It's easier to see the faults in others than ourselves. So broadly, are we trying to make friends or enemies here, right? If someone uses that line, that biblical line around you, it's a great opportunity to focus upon that which you both agree. Like, oh, look, yes, I think so too. I think it's a lot easier to see the faults in others than ourselves. This is actually pretty close to the fundamental attribution error, which is its own type of bias, right? Where, if you slip on the sidewalk, you're like, oh, there was something slippery there. But someone from the outside, like, that person's clumsy. Right?
Yeah.
Right? And this is how we see others differently than we see ourselves.
I am clumsy, though.
Adam bucking the trend. It's better than you. So then you can use that base of commonality, saying, I agree too, to explore other commonalities, right? And after that, then perhaps areas of disagreement. Right? To deny the usefulness or validity is a genetic fallacy, as I said, or approximately guilt by association. We don't want that. Now, all of that said, it's still a little true that biblical sources do have a cultural authority, and it's really hard to dislodge that cultural authority.
So whether or not it's true, people generally believe it's true because in their culture?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that even people who are, say, atheistic, if something's cited as a Bible verse, yes, if they're thinking atheistically, they may have immune reaction to it.
Sure.
But because it holds such weight in our culture, it's just like a Einstein saying something like, oh, well, it has some credibility. Yeah. And I think there's an emotional linkage because the culture, and not everyone was raised with the Bible and so on, but in the North American culture for us, for the most part, it has some credibility.
Yes.
Even if it shouldn't, and even if you intellectually know it shouldn't, there's just something about it that seems either reassuring or traditional or just all the biases that I just mentioned, right? And that's why you have to be. So I'm just trying to highlight that I'm not trying to be coy here and to understand the complexity of the situation. So one should be aware of the different types of moves a person saying such things might be making, right? So someone could be citing a biblical verse, not because they really care that much about the Bible. They just thought it's nice and they're using it for strategic reasons because they can then reach people who believe in the Bible, which is fine as long as it's not sort of malicious and nefarious. You're just saying, to speak to people in a language in which they understand, right?
And even if it's not people that believe in the Bible, it's just still it's still something you're aware of because it's in our culture, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes. So wise to focus on the positives and make friends, but not everyone is a good faith actor and tactics sometimes have to shift. So while I am calling for, people to not be a jerk and so on, there are worlds where you realize you're in more of a contentious or combative situation and making friends is not the right approach. I tend to think, though, most of the time people are using this stuff, it's with people who they still want relationships with, their friends and their family. Or I guess if you're engaging people on the internet, just be cautious because that's often a time sink and it's just a waste of time, right?
Well, arguing on the internet in general is not it's terrible. It's very hard to convince someone that they're wrong on the internet. It's difficult enough to do it in the real world, but it's much harder on the internet.
Right. Yeah. There's a time to deploy and a time to remain silent. This isn't critical thinking per se, but perhaps it should be, right? So that was one example, just kind of leading you through how something might work in practice in a particular case with this biblical verse. There's something else which I don't really have any deep insights here, just wanted to cover, that we all know there's people in this world who are practiced in critical thinking. They've learned these tools and these tactics, and then they seem to have gone in the wrong direction.
Sure.
So there's these cautionary tales of those who seem to be great at critical thinking. They've either written books or essays or held up various ideas, which are like, that person makes sense. That's a trustworthy person. And then they end up believing in conspiracies of one type or another. This is very saddening. And it's not clear exactly how it happens. I mean, people have talked about this lately, like Sam Harris, where people get sort of echo chamber where the fans sort of nudge the presenter of ideas in one direction or another, right? Where some people drop off and they're getting more and more feedback, but somehow certain ideas are onboarded, we become less and less attached to reality. Now, they may say the same thing about people criticizing them. Fair. But it's more that because this could happen to anyone, it seems, even people who are very good at this, we should all be vigilant with ourselves. This goes back to the, easiest person to fool is yourself. So the recommendation here is, as much as possible, to have system checks on your own thinking. And I find this very, very difficult to do, but it's something that's one of the most important things to do.
Yeah, it's very difficult, especially when we're talking about, logical fallacies and stuff like that. There are so many that it's just hard to always apply them to, especially to your own life, to your own way of thinking. Like, they don't always come to mind, or you just discount them. Well, yes, that's true, but it doesn't apply here, right? You would just rule it out.
Like, mistakes were made, but not by me, the name of that book, right?
Yeah. Scout Mindset, right? That's a book by
Julia Galef. Yep.
Julia Galef, very good. And it kind of explains a way of thinking that opens your mind to being open to other ideas. And I think it's easy to have a scout mindset when you are presented with a new idea. Obviously, there's some people they'll jump to a conclusion way too soon, and that's a problem. So I think it's easy to have a scout mindset with new ideas, but it is hard to have it for a long, an idea you've held for a long time. And it is definitely a good idea to interrogate those often.
And I wish I could remember some famous quote about letting your ideas die in your stead, right? But that's something like this, where if you can onboard the notion of your identity being someone who changes their mind.
Yes.
That is very good for your overall well-being to track reality. If you instead you have your idea as the person who believes X or Y very strongly, that's very problematic if you then have to change your mind about X or Y. And so I've noticed this with various friends where very quickly I'm like, oh, okay, that doesn't quite make sense to me, but I'll try to think about it. Or like, oh, is there evidence for that? Or I could be wrong, but let's go through this.
Yep.
And they'll be very defiant. And then you realize when you're having a conversation, you're no longer quite discussing the idea, but almost their like emotional worth. And you're like, oh, this is not that. We don't want to be here, because one's emotional worth should not be wrapped up to an idea, even though you can tell it's part of their core identity. And certainly, again, I'm not naive here. Some deeply held beliefs, it could be on any of the hot button issues. That's going to be very hard if it's not part of your core identity. And you have to have some way of acting in the world. You can't always be like, I don't know. I'll have to wait and see. It's all provisional, right?
Yeah.
But to say like, these are the main beliefs, I have some credence and probability of belief in it, but I'm open to changing my mind better if you can name why you might change your mind, right? And then if that happens or it doesn't, you can try to change your mind or not. All that to say is try to be open to changing your mind and really pay attention to your own emotional reactions to things. I've noticed that when I'm having a discussion with someone, if I think they're wrong, it really feels like they're wrong. Like it really does, right? And especially in some other cases when righteousness kicks in, like not only am I right, but I'm right to be right. Right? Like, oh, I have the angels on my side and they're so wrong, and they'll just see it if I can argue them into it. And this is not a good way to go about things. So if you're feeling that sense of righteousness, this is the time to be extra critical, extra skeptical, and perhaps even take a break. Like that's the other thing, right? Emotions fluctuate in and out, and maybe tomorrow or a week later, you're like, I actually don't feel that strongly about the thing anymore, and maybe they had a good point. I think, as you're saying before, people change their mind on the internet. It's very rare people change their mind, as I say, in real time.
Yeah, you're right.
In one conversation, someone changing their mind. Like I've tried to cultivate this. I can do it sometimes for, again, low value types of things, but for larger issues, that's very difficult. So extend the same courtesy to someone else. If you think you wouldn't change your mind inside of a 5 to 10 minute conversation, chances are they won't either.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. It's let's have a conversation, but now, okay, we've done the work we need to do on this conversation. Let's just take a step back, and maybe you come back to it in a week, and there's been a little bit of thinking, and there's been a little bit of evolution, and maybe that person will end up claiming that they thought differently all along, maybe let them, like if it brings them to the right place.
That is also an excellent point. That what is your goal? This is the point at the beginning. What are you trying to achieve? If you're trying to get someone to move in a direction that you think is more in alignment with reality, and they do, don't punish them for it. Don't make it harder. Reward them. Like, oh yeah, that's great. Sure, right? It is a bit frustrating and sometimes a bit rich when a friend saying like, I think, it's important to be, humble. I was like, what? It's like, this is what I've been telling you. Sure. Okay. I agree. Excellent.
Yeah, you've convinced me.
Yeah, excellent. Do you have a podcast I can listen to? Don't be snotty, Darren. So this is sort of, again, a bit meandering now, but the point has been that there are lists of fallacies and biases, which are good to know. And they're good to have in mind because short-term memory is limited. So to actually incorporate them into your day-to-day, you might have to do some practice. And then once you've been doing it a while, it's easier as a bit of a, cognitive subroutine, for lack of a better phrase. Whereas I'm interacting with the world, I do try to think, am I biased here? Am I looking at this wrong way? Am I not? But you can't do it all the time for the most part, but just try to be aware of that. And then this idea of cultivating critical thinking in yourself, sure, but also in others. So you become almost representative of the tools and methods of rationality and critical thinking when you're talking about this stuff. Yeah. And if you present a negative association, that's not good for your overall goals of having people, A, be more aware of these tools and use them, and B, actually changing their mind in accordance with what you think is reality.
I don't want to start applying these rules to my thinking, or I'm going to start being annoying like Darren type thing.
Yes, Adam, thank you.
But no, I don't think you're annoying, Adam. Just illustrating.
But I mean, like, usefully annoying. I mean, it's okay to be annoying sometimes.
I hope so.
Well, the line, we've been doing this podcast so long, right? I say I'm either more interesting or annoying at dinner parties. It depends on the audience.
I'm reading Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, and it goes over a lot of these sort of like fundamental ways of treating things critically. And at one point, I think he's talking about logical fallacies or some sort of, things to put in your toolkit. And he says, oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. And it'll make you more interesting at parties. And I was like, is that a joke? Because I think it's not true, right? But the way he says it was really like, oh yeah, if you can like really bring up some interesting facts, you'll be more interesting at parties.
That's like, funny. Just going for the outlier. Or you're Carl Sagan. You're interesting at parties.
I think so.
And everyone finds you interesting and it's worked out for you. And maybe he was doing a bit of that's not hindsight bias, but it is a bit of a logical error.
Yeah, he is interesting at parties because he's very charismatic and he's a good science communicator and yada, yada, yada. So he kind of, wants to espouse those values in others. And there are aspects of sort of a scientific worldview and whatever that can make you more interesting at parties if you're not a jerk about it.
Maybe we all just have to talk like this. Like Carl Sagan. How could this work? I'll work on my Carl Sagan impression.
That was Agent Smith.
Mr. Anderson. They're the same person, Adam. I don't hear any difference. All right. Enough of my segment. Try to cultivate critical thinking, y'all. And please write in if you have any other suggestions on fallacies or biases that you prefer to highlight instead of the ones I did.
Yeah, leave a comment with your favorite. I'm curious to see.
Accuse me of the error that I made. We all know it's cool to cultivate critical thinking. But is it cool to let your food cool before you put it in the fridge, Adam?
I want to say literally it is cool, but literally it isn't because it'll be cooler if you put it in the fridge quicker.
Figuratively. Tell us more.
But yes, maybe it's cool to not follow the rules. I don't know. I'm not very cool. You may not have noticed, listeners, after 692 episodes, but I'm not the coolest guy on the block.
We think you're cool, Adam.
Thank you. My mom thinks I'm cool. I recently got a segment suggestion from our good friend, Producer Pat, who asked me to look into whether or not you should let food cool before putting it in the fridge. This was not a myth I'd heard before, so it seemed worth covering. And although this wasn't really something I ever did myself, in some extreme cases, I did let food cool before putting it into the fridge, so I thought maybe this would apply. For example, I do a bit of meal prep. I make my lunches for a few days at a time, ahead of time. And I find that the air in the container is too hot when I put it in the fridge, so it'll contract and makes the lid harder to pull off. So I sometimes let it cool before I put the lid on. So that's probably a form of cooling things before they go into the fridge, but I don't think that's really what this myth is about.
So your main reason is like being able to open a container or not?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because it's like a glass container with a plastic lid, so it creates a bit of not a vacuum, but it creates a bit of a suction effect, and sometimes it's harder to open. And then depending what's in it, sometimes when you pop it open, it can splash around and make a mess or whatever.
Adam leads an adventurous life.
So digging into this idea, I found that some people will let their food cool for hours before putting it in the fridge, which seemed potentially dangerous to me. So what's the best thing to do? And what's the scientific reasoning behind it? So, the science. What is the problem here?
What would you say is your major malfunction?
The problem is something that we don't really see with the naked eye. It's something that's called bacteria. So if we didn't have bacteria, we'd all be dead. But if we didn't have all bacteria...
And so would they.
Yeah. If we didn't have bacteria, you could just leave your food out at room temperature indefinitely. Assuming you don't have cats. You wouldn't need a fridge. Just leave your food there.
I now think most things you say should assuming you don't have cats. Just stick that in there.
Yeah. So we put stuff in the fridge. The entire reason for which fridges exist is so that bacteria grows more slowly. You put stuff in the freezer and, the bacteria mostly dies and won't really grow at all. So I won't say you can keep things in the freezer indefinitely, but from a bacterial point of view, there's not going to be any bacteria growing in your freezer. So what's the danger zone? Dangerous bacterial growth happens between temperatures of 5 and 57 degrees Celsius. That's 41 and 135 degrees Fahrenheit for our American friends.
Those also include much of my favorite Celsiuses.
They are. These are like the Celsiuses I want to live in and not the ones that I'm just like, oh, I hate winter in Canada. Fridges are generally kept below 4 degrees Celsius. I think mine's set to like 3 or something like that. You want it to be over 0. Basically, you want your liquids to not freeze. So they'll freeze at 0 or 32 Fahrenheit. But still be at a temperature where the bacteria will not flourish. So when your food is hot, right out of the stove or right off the barbecue or air fryer, microwave oven, whatever you're using to cook it, it's probably hot enough that you don't have any active bacterial growth. So you'll often see cooking guides about meat suggesting a sustained internal temperature of 145 Fahrenheit for medium rare, which is 10 Fahrenheit over the danger zone, or even higher for more well-done meats, ground meats, and things like that. Some meats are more dangerous than others for bacterial growth. The point of this is to kill the bacteria. So you've got your hot food. The bacteria is dead, but it's sitting out and creeping into the danger zone. So bacteria can get back on it and bacteria can start to reproduce again. The quicker you put it in the fridge, the quicker it will get to a lower temperature at which there is no bacterial growth. By this logic, putting it in the fridge right away keeps it out of that danger zone as quickly as possible, and that's better. Keeping it out for a short time is fine, because there isn't much time for bacteria to grow, but keeping it out for hours is not good. Now, one concern is that the food is so hot that it will raise the temperature of the surrounding food in the fridge by a few degrees, putting it back into the danger zone, which kind of defies the whole purpose of a fridge.
Took the whole fridge with you, man.
Mm-hmm. So is this plausible? Maybe, depending on the size of the dish and the temperature, like the volume, basically, and what else is in the fridge, this could be a problem. I probably wouldn't take a boiling pot of soup and put it right in the fridge, right? That's a lot of heat. It's a lot of energy that's going into your fridge. Something that is scalding hot can cool down slightly before being put into the fridge. And it wouldn't need to be out for a few hours, but basically like that cooling from that high temperature would happen pretty quickly anyway. Usually if I'm having dinner, I have the food out while I eat. Then when everyone's done eating, it gets packed up, goes in the fridge. So that food's been sitting out for what? 20, 30 minutes. It's cool enough to safely go in the fridge at that point. It's not like really piping hot. And it's also about the speed of cooling. A very hot item will cool on the counter or in the fridge, but as the hot item becomes warm near room temperature, the speed of cooling is much more gradual and it will cool much more quickly if it's in the fridge, even if it's still much hotter than the room. So
yes, I was wondering about that too. Like, okay, yes, it would cool more quickly in the fridge, but if something's super hot, is the difference that great if it's on the counter versus in the fridge when it's super hot? But as it goes lower in temperature is what you're saying, that well, then it makes more sense to put it in the fridge. Yeah,
something scalding hot will relatively cool similarly on the counter versus in the fridge, but something that's just kind of warm, it'll cool much quicker in the fridge. So another specific concern I saw was the fridge has a sort of average temperature it keeps. And I'm not sure where the temperature sensor in the fridge is, but if you happen to put a very hot item that ends up closer to the sensor, the fridge will think it's hotter than it is, and it'll work overtime to cool. And this could bring the temperature at some parts of the fridge colder and below freezing, basically to get the average temperature low or the temperature where it's hot low, and then you have stuff that freezes in your fridge.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever experienced anything like this in my fridge.
No, I don't think so either. Although there's times when just I've turned the fridge a bit too cold.
Yeah.
Right? And you're like, okay, a pop at the back of the fridge that is open.
Yes.
It starts to have some ice form.
Yeah.
Or like some vegetables, you're like, I think there's not ice crystals, whatever the term might be, but it's starting to freeze a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's maybe parts of it's never even, but I think maybe there's parts of the fridge that's closer to whatever the cooling element that can get a little colder. So that's possible. But yeah, like me putting something hot in and seeing like something freeze because of it, I don't think I've ever seen that. It is theoretically possible. Again, don't put 10 liters of boiling hot, almost still steaming soup in your fridge, and it probably won't happen.
Also, I just want to say, if you have space for 10 liters of soup, you have more than one fridge or a very large fridge.
Yeah. If you happen to have very large amounts of food to refrigerate, you're better off trying to split it into smaller parts or to cool them off like with water or an ice bath before putting in the fridge, right? If you got a big Tupperware or a big pot or something like that, run some cold water on it and it'll actually cool it off pretty quickly. It'll help avoid changing the temperature of your fridge, but also help cool the food faster so that it gets out of that danger zone even faster than maybe your fridge would. So what should you not do? You should not leave your cooked food at room temperature for more than 2 hours. Leaving your food out to cool it for too long, especially if you might forget to put it away, is a much greater health risk due to bacterial growth than a minor change in temperature of other foods in the fridge. So I mentioned that the dangerous zone is between 5 Celsius and 57 Celsius, but warm food is much more dangerous than something that's just the bottom of the danger zone around 6 or 7 Celsius. So that minor change in the fridge, that's not what's going to cause a huge problem. Having it on the counter is.
It's basically the higher the temperature, the more the bacteria.
Yes,
broadly speaking.
Yeah, within a certain range. So something sort of a little warm out of your fridge is pretty bad. Don't leave your food out at hot temperatures. So over 32 degrees or 90 degrees Fahrenheit for more than an hour, that's bad. Leftover confusion have you hot under the collar? Well, chill out. If you don't want to get sick, then reducing the amount of time you leave your food out is a good idea. Get in the fridge to cool quickly, separating it or cooling it in a water or ice bath ahead of time to avoid too much bacteria.
That is some good practical advice. Thank you, Adam. I've wondered this myself, and I should probably put stuff... I think I'm pretty good. I think I like to try to have it cool down a bit more outside the fridge before I put it in the fridge. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's ideal when there's Canadian winters. I just put stuff on my balcony.
Oh, interesting.
I'm like, well, that outside is about the same as a fridge. Sometimes it's colder.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's fine before it goes back to the fridge, right? The key is you can't forget it out there.
Well, this is the problem, right? Like, I'll leave stuff out, and it's like, oh, yeah, and I'll go on and watching a movie or whatever, and I'll be like, oh, man, that's been there for an hour. And then I'm not going to throw it out, but I put it in the fridge.
Well, that's the other thing that, although it may not be good for you, we've all done it. Most of our lives, we've eaten all this bacteria. And for the most part, we're all okay with it. It's like these recommendations on eating rice. You're like, what are you supposed to do? Come on. No one does that with rice.
And I think practically, like, I don't want to give people bad advice here, but like, I very rarely, probably almost never get sick from just like food that's gone bad, just because if it's questionable, I'll just throw it out.
Well, thank you, Adam. And thanks for joining us once again, listeners. I talked to you about cultivating critical thinking, and there's a broad range of ways you can do this. Learning the basics and then trying to apply them, especially to yourself, is what I recommend. And Adam talked to us about chilling out in the fridge. It's better for your overall health. Until next time, think better, to act better.
Peace out, Ice Cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.